Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So this week we are going to be talking about the Stam, and we'll say in 1 minute what that is. But I'm super excited to share about it with you. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So for those of you who weren't here with us last week, what we'll do is I'll ask you to kind of hold your questions, and I'll just talk for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes at the end where people can put questions into the chat. So if you have questions as I'm talking and they come up for you, definitely hold on to them, write them down somewhere, and then towards the end, you'll have the opportunity to put them into the chat, and I'll get through as many as I can before we have to wrap up for today. Okie dokie, let's get going. All right, so just to kind of take us from what we were doing last week, which we called the backbone of the Talmud, which is the Mishnah, to this week where we're talking about the Stam, which is the connector. So the Mishnah, as we spoke about last week, is the Talmud's organizing principle. And then on top of the Mishnah, we have the Gemara, which is made up of Amoraic statements, quotations from earlier material like Mishna and Baraita. Baraita, we spoke about last year as kind of just outside. That's what Baraita means. It means outside material that's from the same time period of the Mishnah, but didn't make it into the Mishnah. So we have Mishnah, Baraita, and then we have Amoraic material. And then we have Stam. And the Gemara, which is the Amoraim, Stam, Baraita, they ask all sorts of questions about the Mishnah. They compare the Mishnah to other texts, they analyze its language, they find logical flaws, and then they also offer resolutions to those questions. And we saw this all last week. They also go on tangents, they tell stories, all sorts of great stuff. This week, we're going to be picking apart what we call the Gemara. So we're going to be slicing and dicing between Amoraim and Stam so that we can analyze the Stam. So what is the Stam? The Stam, which means literally the plain voice. For those of you who are familiar with the word Stam in modern Hebrew, it could mean like joking or I was just saying or something like that. And it still has this like plain sort of meaning to it. When you use it in the Gemara, that's what it means. It means the plain voice. It's the anonymous editorial voice of the Talmud Bavli that discusses and organizes all of the earlier material. Scholars often attempt to identify layers or genres within the Stam and then associate them with different groups of people or different periods of time. Probably the most important scholar to do this is Professor David Weiss Halivni, alav hashalom. And in fact, there's another book that's coming out posthumously of his, and Rabbanit Michelle just sent me today, like excitedly, oh, in the introduction of this book, there's going to be a whole new, like fresh layout by him of all the different levels within the Stam. So we can't wait to see that. And he's definitely kind of one of a number, but probably one of the most important scholars really doing that work. So when was the Stam approximately? And again, it kind of depends. All the different levels of the Stam get then traced onto historical kind of time periods, but we're more or less talking about in 100-year period between the Bavli getting compiled and the beginning of the Gaonic time period, so about 500 to 600 of the Common Era. Sometimes we call that the Savoraim. So the Savoraim are the ones who edit the Talmud. And then sometimes we say, oh, and what's the voice of the Savoraim in the Talmud? The voice of the Savoraim is the Stam. Or sometimes we say, no, there were actually at the beginning of that time period, there were Stamaim and they wrote the Stam. And then there's actually a later Savorai voice, and that's a different group of people, and they write in a slightly different genre or different voice. So we'll try and see a little bit where that might be coming from today. Obviously, all of this is subject to a scholarly debate. How do I recognize the Stam? Okay, I'm not a scholar. I'm not Professor Weiss Halivni, who knows every word in the Talmud backwards and forwards. So what am I supposed to do? So the Stam is the anonymous voice. If you have a sentence that starts without a voice, without a Amar so-and-so, without said rabbi, named rabbi, and it's in the Talmud and not in the Mishnah. Last week we mentioned an anonymous voice in the Mishnah is called the Tanakama, and that usually is someone who the Talmud's then going to try and identify who that Tana is. That's not the Stam. The Stam is in the Gemara, and it's an anonymous voice within the Gemara. it's going to almost always be in Aramaic. Sometimes, and we'll break this down further, sometimes the Stam is the main voice on the page. We'll see two examples of that. Other times the Stam chimes into the conversation. And the third kind of category that I'll look at is times when the Stam operates almost silently in the background, pages where you have very, very little Stam. So we'll look at kind of three examples of those. And in English translation, so for those of you who maybe when you open a Gemara, you're reading it in the Steinsaltz or in the Koren Steinsaltz, or you're reading it in the Art Scroll, a good hint that what you're reading is Stam is when the English says, the Gemara says. So it'll say, the Gemara asks, or the Gemara says. Who is the Gemara? I would say the Gemara is Stam. That's the Stam asking that question. And it just gets translated as the Gemara says, the Gemara asks. But those two, I would say those things are kind of interchangeable. And in some ways, calling it the Gemara is confusing, because if I said to you, I'm learning the Gemara in Sota, I don't mean I'm only learning the Stam. I mean, I'm learning the Talmud Bavli, typically, the Talmud Bavli of Masachet Sota, not only the Stam tied into the Talmud Bavli in Masachet Sota. It would be a very strange job to only read the Stam. I don't think anyone does that. All right, so let's dive in. So we're going to look now at three examples of when the Stam is the main voice on the page. So one way to recognize this is that in many Masachtot, the opening pages are mainly Stam. Many scholars think that this is a later layer of Stam than what exists in other parts of the Bavli, where the Stam is more intertwined with Amoraic debates. And some people then would call this level of the Stam Savorai. The Stam in these cases will often be interested in asking extremely detailed questions about the specific word choices that a Mishnah is making. And they're not just like, oh, that's so curious. They're actually going to draw halachic conclusions from their very specific word choices. That there are very specific questions about specific word choices that the Mishnah is making. And we'll see some examples of that in a second to kind of make it clear. And the Stam here, it's not just, oh, chatter or like, wow, I'm explaining something that's already there. They're often really introducing important concepts that we do not see in earlier material, but that really kind of affect people's lives, that are really, really important up to today. So let's see what that looks like. Here we are, the opening lines of Masachet Bava Batra. So the Mishnah says, Hashutafim sharatu la'asot mechitza, partners who wish to make a mechitza, and we're going to ask in the Gemara, what is a mechitza? Partners, but let's call it a partition for now. Partners who wish to make a partition in a joint piece of land. So let's say me and my neighbor, we each own our two houses, but the property in between is joint. And now we actually want to say, no, I'm putting up I want to separate between my property and your property. We're not co-owning this property anymore. We're splitting up this property. So what are they supposed to do? So the shutafim, the co-owners, the partners who want to make that division, bonim eta kotel ba'amta. They are supposed to build the wall for the partition in the middle of the courtyard. So the Stam asks on this is the opening lines of the Gemara. Savruha, the sages initially assumed, or they were thinking about it, they were wondering about, my mechitza, what is this word mechitza? Well, a mechitza is a guda. It means a physical partition. And so you understand the Gemara, the Mishnah's meaning, Tama deratzu, that they want to build this wall in the middle because they both wish to put up a fence or build a partition across their jointly owned courtyard. Haloratzu ein machayavinoto. But if they didn't actually both want to put up this fence, they wanted to just continue going on the way that they were, or they wanted to recognize a division in their property, but they didn't want to build the fence, they don't need to. So, haloratzu ein machayavinoto. Alma, and says the Stam, what can you learn out of that? Alma hezek re'iyah lav shmei hezek. You can learn from this that damage caused by sight is not called damage. Because once we're no longer fully co-owners of this space, but actually some of this is your space and some of it is mine, then the fact that I can look into your space without any kind of physical obstruction If I'm okay with that, or if one side is okay with it and the other's not, we can't force the building of a partition. If even one side doesn't want that partition, we can't force it. And that person who did want it can't say, I'm being damaged just because my neighbor can see onto my property. He's not allowed to make a claim like that because we don't see damage caused by sight. We don't see Hazek Riyah in this Mishnah. That's the first understanding potentially by the Stam. But the second understanding by the Stam is actually my mechitza, ema mechitza plukta. Let's say that the mechitza actually means, no, we're going to make a division. The kivan deratzu bonina takoktel ba'al korcho. Since even one party wants to build a partition, we actually force the second party to, yes, agree to build a partition. And so if you're reading that into the Mishnah, then what can you learn about damage caused by sight? What can you learn about Hazek Riyah? Alma Hazek Riyah Shmei Hazek. Then Hazek Riyah is damage caused by sight is in fact called damage. So here we see the Stam asking a very specific question about the Mishnah. What does this word mechitzad mean? Does this word mechitzah mean if everyone wants to build a wall, then they build a wall? Or does it mean they both want to split the property and one side wants a wall and the other doesn't? But once they split the property, can you force the other guy to build it because it causes me damage that he has perfect sight lines into my property? And here you see the Stam introducing an entire form of nezek, an entire kind of nezek that does not exist in Tanaitic material. All of a sudden, you have a type of nezek, a type of damage that is caused just by people looking at you. Foucault has a lot to say about this, by the way. And all of a sudden, you have maybe a right to privacy, which is so interesting. And it's a very late development within the Gemara, totally introduced by the Stam, but a right that gets questioned and dealt with and contemplated by generations of Torah scholars to come, because the Stam introduces it and it's now part of the Gemara and it's read into this Mishnah. But you could certainly make good sense of this Mishnah without having any kind of concept of Hazek Riyah. And maybe you wouldn't need to be talking about whether we have a right to privacy or whether damage can be caused by sight or not, unless the Stam had introduced this philosophical legal concept into our tradition, and now it's there to stay. So that's just one example of the tremendous power of the Stam. Here's another one. This one hits close to home, maybe. This is from the opening lines of Masachet Kiddushin. The Mishnah says, a woman is acquired, she becomes betrothed to a man in 3 ways. And the Gemara says, it should have taught, the Mishnah should have said, instead of the woman is acquired, it should have said, in the passive, right, a woman is acquired, should have said in the active, a man acquires. And the Stam says, here's why it doesn't say it in the more maybe polished, active voice we would have expected. Itana Kona, if it had said the man acquires the woman, Hava Amina, I would have thought, Afilu Ba'al Korcha. I would have thought, we're going to come back to that term Hava Amina soon, so just hold on to that. Hava Amina, I would have thought, even against her will, Tana Isha Nikneit. So the Mishnah uses the language. The Mishnah centers the woman and says the woman is acquired to teach the midata in shalom midata lo. He can acquire her if she gives consent, and if she does not give consent, then there cannot be conducion against her will. She cannot be betrothed against her will. Again, a super important, world-changing type of reading, introduction of a halacha that happens entirely in the Stam. And that's that very kind of sophisticated, almost nitty-gritty Stam that's at the beginning of a masachet, that's doing this big heavy lift in introducing totally new concepts, not just elucidating old concepts, but asking a new question on the Mishnah and really going in from there into introducing a new halachic concept that has become and stayed core since it was introduced. There's another way in which the Stam can manifest as the main voice on the page, and that can happen when you have a debate between Tanaim or Amoraim, and the Stam thinks that debate could have been continued. So in these situations, what the Stam will do is it will actually kind of commandeer the conversation and it will begin to play both sides. So it will say, it'll bring, person A says something, person B says something else. Maybe that's the entirety of that Tannaitic debate or the Amaraic debate. And the Stam will say, oh, but what about this question? Well, person A would have responded like this, and person B would have responded like that. And they'll just keep playing out person A and person B, almost like impersonating them. And we'll see exactly how that looks. So we have an example here. The Mishnah says, Kol hashofarot kashirim chutz mishal para mipnei shehu karen. All shofarot are fit for blowing. We're on Rosh Hashanah. We're Rosh Hashanah 26a, except for a cow horn, because cow horns are horns and they're not shofars. Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Valo kol shofarot nikru karen. Rabbi Yossi says, all shofars are called karen. Shnama arbim shoch karen hayovel, as it is stated. In Joshua, they're going to sound a long blast of the karen, a long blast of the horn. And in Joshua 6, that's the destruction of Jericho. They're gonna blast the shofar and the walls are gonna come down. And it says karen hayovel. The shofar is referred to as a karen in Joshua 6. It's referred to as a horn. So maybe the Tanakhama's assumption that a cow horn is called a horn and not a shofar is wrong, because all shofars are called horns. Okay. So the Gemara starts out by saying, Shapir Kama Rabbi Yossi. Yeah, Rabbi Yossi is saying this really right. Like, Rabbi Yossi, that sounds great. We're convinced by Rabbi Yossi. What would the rabbis say back to Rabbi Yossi? Like, if what Rabbi Yossi says is so convincing, then shouldn't the rabbis have a chance to respond? So now the Stam is going to come in and start impersonating the rabbis, and we're going to know that it's an impersonation because all of a sudden the rabbis of the Mishnah are speaking Aramaic. So that's a big tell. When the rabbis of the Mishnah start speaking Aramaic, we're no longer in Tannaitic material. So Verabanan, Kol shofarot ikru shofar. That word ikru, that's an Aramaic word. So the rabbis say, all other shofar are called shofar vet ikru karen, and they're also called a horn. But dipara, and that dalid, that's an Aramaic prefix. So that horn of a cow, karen ikre, shofar lo ikre. So the horn of a cow is called a karen, it's called a horn, but it is not called a shofar. And they bring an example of an opportunity where a cow horn could have been called a shofar and maybe was not, from Deuteronomy 33, V'chor sharo hadar lo v'karnei re'am karnav. His firstborn bull, grandeur is his horns, karnav, are the horns of karnei, a wild ox. It's therefore clear that the horns of a bull are called karen. Nowhere are they called shofar. Rabbi Yossi Amar Lach, and this Amar Lach is another tell that it's not actually Rabbi Yossi. The words itself say Rabbi Yossi would say to you, right? Rabbi Yossi's not here, but if he were here, this is what he would say. That's what the Stam is doing. Rabbi Yossi Amar Lach, Zepara Nami Yikri Shofar. No way, says Rabbi Yossi, that the horns of a cow are also called shofar. Dechtiv v'teitiv lahashem mishor par. It shall please the Lord better than an ox bull that has horns and hooves, but also that language Tetiv Lashem Mishor Par comes up if you're hearing it in a high holidays. Nusach HaTfilah, that line is in there also. So now you'll think of it when it comes up on Rosh Hashanah. Im shor lama par v'im par lama shor. If it's an ox, why are you calling it a bull? And if it's a bull, why are you calling it an ox? Right? These words seem redundant. And he's going to say it's a word play. Ella my shor par. What is this word shor par? It's a shofar. Teitiv Lashem mi shofar. It should please the Lord better than not an ox bull. It should please the Lord better than a shofar. It's a play on words, says the Stam in the name of Rabbi Yossi. They say, okay, how would Rabbanan reply to that? The rabbis would say that's not what that line means. That's not what shorpar means. Shorpar does not mean shofar. Shorpar means gadol kepar, and they see that and they quote in the name of Rav Matna. But it's still the Stam saying, how would the rabbis respond to our invented response by Rabbi Yossi, the rabbis would respond by quoting this Emmerich statement by Rav Matna, who says, what is shor par? That is a shor that is the size of a bull that's an ox that's the size of a bull from when it's born, like just a really big baby ox. That's Rav Matna's understanding. And then we have Ula chiming in, and Ula is now an Amora, and so you could say, like, and once you have an Amora chiming in, so the question is, like, how did Ula get there? Like, was it actually that at some point we just had this Mishnah and then Ula appeared? Was it, and then like Ula's statement was actually on the Mishnah, but it doesn't really read that way. It really reads like Ula is just chiming into this it seems like Ula is just chiming in to this Stam conversation. He says, Hainu Tamad Rabbanan. This is the reasoning of the rabbis, Kid de Rav Chisda, who hold like Rav Chisda, and then he's going to quote Rav Chisda. What does Rav Chisda say? Why on Yom Kippur does the high priest not go into the Holy of Holies wearing his golden outfit? Because a prosecutor cannot become an advocate. The prosecutor is, in this case, the golden calf we just read about this week's Parsha. So if a prosecutor cannot become an advocate, then the high priest can't wear gold, and you can't blow shofar using a cow. So one way to read it is to say, yes, we used to have this debate, and originally, before the Stam, we had Ula just chiming in immediately saying, yeah, Rabbi Yossi, you seem so convincing, but actually, we don't do that. The rabbis don't believe that because there's another problem with the cow horn. It's not about whether a cow horn is a shofar or not. I'm convinced maybe the cow horn is a shofar, says Ula. There's another problem with the cow, and that is that it reminds Hashem of the golden calf, and we don't want to be doing that on Rosh Hashanah, so we don't blow with the cow horn. But if you read Ula continuous with the Stam, it actually just seems like it fits in perfectly. And that really shows you the beauty of the Stam and the artistry of the Stam, that they can have their whole conversation and they'll be bringing in actual quotes from Amoraim that seem like they're just flying in perfectly with the conversation that is being invented by the Stam. So just to recap a piece of vocabulary that we just saw, whenever you see Amar Lach, would say to you, that's how you know the Stam is impersonating a rabbi, and kind of expanding on a pre-existing argument and adding in, kind of continuing the argument until they feel compelled by it in one way or another. All right, so the next category, those were all cases where the Stam is really the primary voice on the page. So either it's a case where it's the opening of a masachet and the Stam is just going to give kind of its opening philosophical salvo, or you have cases where the Stam picks up on an earlier debate and then goes to town on it, and that can go on for a really long time. The other way the Stam can appear is that the Stam will just kind of weave its way into another debate. So when the Stam chimes in, that's what I'm calling that. So what happens is it'll turn a collection of statements into a conversation that will have a clear flow. The Stam will clarify statements made by earlier generations of scholars, and they'll often do that by adding in brand new concepts. The Stam sometimes points out or attempts to resolve contradictions that in previous generations were just sort of left open. It will attempt to clarify the halacha, or it will arbitrate disputes. And I would say that when the Stam chimes in, that this case is the majority of the Babli, that you really have this full weave of Stam, Braita, Amoraic discussions all put together. And the Stam is the last level, and the Stam is what's kind of tying it all together. All right, so here's one example. So the Mishnah says, in the morning, you make 2 blessings before Shema. So the Stam then asks, "My mevarich, what are those blessings? What's the nature of those blessings?" Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Oshaya. So Rabbi Yaakov says the name of Rabbi Oshaya, who is a first generation of Moran in the land of Israel. What do you say? You say Yotzer or Uvore Choshech. And then the Stam brings in a Havamina. So we already saw an example of a Havamina. Here we're seeing it again through this language of Lema. Let it say, shouldn't the bracha be not Yotzer or Uvore Choshech, who forms light and creates darkness? It should say, who forms light and creates brightness, with the assumption of, shouldn't we say it in like the nicest possible way, which we'll see in a second. But isn't that so much nicer than blessing God for creating darkness? Who likes darkness? And the answer that the Stam gives, so the Stam talks to itself all the time. The Stam talks to itself all the time. The Stam says, shouldn't it say like this? The answer is no. Kedechtiv kamrinan. We say blessings as the verse is written in the Bible. That's Isaiah 45:7. That's what we say. So again, this vocabulary note, lema, let it say. And this is used to introduce a proposal that will ultimately be rejected. So shouldn't it say, let it say, creates light and brightness? No, it's going to be rejected. And when you see a lema, you should start looking for the rejection already. It's usually just a couple words away. Another name for a proposal that will ultimately be rejected is a havamina. Hava meaning I would have said or I would have thought this. So we have to be taught that it's wrong. Havamina is like a wrong opinion that they want to bring out in order to teach you that it's a wrong opinion, and sometimes even to teach you other things also. All right, so here we continue in our Gemara about the morning blessings before Shema. Elamiata, but hold on. The verse in Isaiah goes on to say, who makes peace and creates evil. But in our tefillah, we don't say it as it's written in the verse. Rather, the verse says ra, the verse says evil, hakol, but we say, right, makes peace and creates everything. Lishna ma'alia, hachinami lema noga, lishna ma'alia. Rather, it's written evil. We euphemistically recite blessing all things, right? We euphemistically say hakol. So let's use a euphemism for darkness. Also, let us euphemistically say brightness. And now we're going to see that Stam was like a nice addition. And now we're jumping right back to an Amoraic statement. Ella Amarava, rather Rava says, Kedela haskir midat yom balayla midat laila bayom. The reason we recite who creates darkness is in order to mention the attribute of day at night and the attribute of night at day. And then the Stam comes back in and says, okay, bishlama midat laila bayom kedamrin and yotzer or v'rech. Granted that the attribute of night is mentioned during the day, as we say, who forms light and creates darkness. Ela midat yom balayla hechi mashkachala. But where do you find the attribute of day mentioned at night? Okay, that's a nice opinion, but like, does it actually work out? That's our bishlama. Granted, but it's almost always bishlama, ella. Granted, but. So it'll point out that the claim under discussion seems to be or is only partially true. So this language of bishlama also comes up all over the Bavli. Really useful language to know. The root of bishlama is shalom, right? So maybe that's a way to remember it. Like bishalom, it goes nicely what so-and-so said, or granted what so-and-so said, but this other piece of it doesn't make sense for some reason. So in here we say, right, Rava just said we're supposed to mention day at night and night at day. And they say, okay, night at day, I see, because we have Yotzer or Vorei Choshech. But what about the opposite? How does that work? So then Abaye says, right, and Abaye and Rava are the same generation. We talked about this in the last chorus, right? They're bar plugta, they're like frequent debate partners. And they were also potentially at least like raised together, and they were chavruta from when they were very little. We have a very sweet story about that. So Abaye says, Golel or mivnei choshech v'choshech mivnei. Or Abaye says, nevertheless, the attribute of day is mentioned at night when we say rolling away light before darkness and darkness before the light. Golel or mivnei choshech v'choshech mivnei. Or when we talk about or, that's talking about the daytime. So we have actually, right, we have this question framed by a bishlama, and now Abaye comes to answer it. Okay, so we just talked about the bishlama, bishalom, right? Granted, but points out that the claim under discussion seems to be or is only partially true. And in our case, right, it was raised. Hold on, this doesn't seem right. It only seems to be partially true. No, comes Abaye to answer the Bishlama, and Abaye says, no, it actually is fully true because we have Golel or Mipnei Choshech v'Choshech Mipnei Or, and we say that at night, and it mentions Or, so we talk about the day at night as well. All right, so what would this Gemara look like without the Stam? So first of all, it would be way shorter. But here's what it would look like, right? We would have our Mishnah, in the morning we recite 2 blessings beforehand. We would have our statement by Rabbi Ushaya. What is one of them? Who forms light and creates darkness. Rava would say, why do we say that? We say that in order to mention day at night and night at day. And then Abaye would just chime in with, yep, and the way we do that at night is Golel or Mipnei Choshech v'Choshech Mipnei Or. That actually makes a lot of sense. But you still kind of wonder, it could actually be, without the Stam, you would wonder, are Rav Oshaya and Abaye disagreeing? The way I just read it to you was very influenced by the Stam's framing of Abaye. But without the Stam, you might say, what are the 2 that we say before? Well, you would have Rabbi Oshaya saying, Yotzer Or V'Orei Choshech, and we know that there's 2, so maybe it's Yotzer Or V'Orei Choshech 1, 2 is Golel or Mipnei Choshech v'Choshech Mipnei Or. Or you could say, actually, Rabbi Yoshaya and Abaye has different opinions about what the bracha is. Maybe Abaye in Bavel versus Rabbi Yoshaya in Eretz Yisrael thought that even in the morning, you should say Golel or Mipnei Choshech v'Choshech Mipnei Or, right? So actually, without the Stam, you don't really understand how these 2 positions fit together. They could fit together in a whole variety of ways. And beyond that, the Stam has a whole conversation about, do we need to quote perfectly the psukim? What's the balance between quoting the psukim exactly as they are versus using what the Gemara calls like Lishna Ma'alya, using like high language, almost like edited language? Do we really want to talk about Choshech? Maybe we should just talk about Noga. Maybe we should talk about brightness instead of darkness. Maybe, maybe that's too dark. And the Stam, by chiming in, adds in all of these other concepts, all these other questions that you might have asked had just these 3 lines been our Gemara, and clarifies how Rabbi Oshaya and Abaye fit together. So right with the Stam, we know that Rabbi Oshaya is saying this is what we say in the morning, and Abaye is saying this is what we say at night. But if you didn't have the Stam, that would not be clear at all. All right, here's another example. Here we start out with an Amoraic debate. Amar Rav Huna says, Hayam halich b'derech u'b'midbar ve'inu yodea imatai Shabbat. You're walking along in the desert, and you do not know when Shabbat occurs. What do? Monash yisha yamim u'meshamer yom echad. He says you just start counting 6 days, and then after 6 days, you're going to keep 1 day of Shabbos. Chia Barav disagrees. Chia Barav says, Mishamer Yom Echad U'Monash Yisha. Chia Barav says, the minute you don't know when Shabbos is, that day is Shabbos, and then you're going to count another 6. Okay, so we have a debate amongst Amoraim, and then the Stam is going to come in and ask, "B'mai kamipalgai?" In like Ashkenazi yeshiva settings, they often pronounce this word kamiflagay. It's the same word. B'mai kamipalgai? What, with regard to what exactly are they disagreeing? And then the Stam gets to philosophize or do like conceptual analysis. And here they do a really particularly beautiful job with that, I think. So with regard to what they disagree, Mar Savar Kibriat Hoshal Olam, one sage. And then this is like the translation here kind of includes Rashi, who clarifies like how this works. So one sage says it's like the creation of the world. So in the creation of the world, you have, right, 6 days of creation and then 1 day of Shabbat. So that maps on to Rav Huna's position where you count 6 days and then you have Shabbos. Umar Savar Ka'adam Harishon. But the other one says it's like humans first experience Shabbos. It's like Adam, the first man, he was created on the 6th day. So then when was Shabbos for humans? Shabbos for humans is Shabbos and then 6 days of work. Which, like, first of all, have you ever thought of that before? Like, what a beautiful distinction. There's the God perspective, which is 6 days and then Shabbat, versus the human perspective, which is Shabbat and then 6 days. And we often talk about how Shabbos sits kind of in the middle. It's the end of one week, also the beginning of the next week, and it carries characteristics of both. So here's a great source for that and a great perspective on, is it the God perspective where Shabbos is the rest at the end of creation, or is it the Adam perspective where Shabbos is the beginning of where you're going? And so all of that is introduced by the Stam just by looking at this Amoraic debate and saying, well, what's at the core of their argument? And then answering that question. So we saw this question, B'mai Kamipalge, with regard to what exactly do they disagree, sometimes pronounced B'mai Kamipalge. Okay, so then the Gemara keeps going and actually brings in a meitave, an objection from a Breita. So here's the Breita. Hayam alech v'derech ve'inu yodeh imatai Shabbat mishamer yom echad l'shisha. So if a person is walking along the way, does not know when Shabbat occurs, he observes 1 day for every 6. So that's really ambiguous, 1 day for every 6. And the Stam is going to point out just how ambiguous it is. My lav moneh shisha mishamer yom echad. Lo, mishamer yom echad moneh shisha. The Stam's going to say, so what, does that mean that he counts 6 days and then keeps Shabbos? No, it could also mean he counts 1 day, he counts 1 Shabbos, and then counts 6 days. So the Gemara says, if so, if that's what the Breita meant, Mishamer Yom Echad L'Shisha, why does it say he observes 1 day for 6? Mishamer Yom Echad Umoneh Shisha. It should have said he observes 1 day and counts 6, right? So the Gemara, so the Stam sort of thinks really it's he observes 6 days and then has Shabbos. That seems to be the Stam's interpretation of this Breita. But without the Stam, we would never really know what this Breita means. The ambiguity would be both underexplored, but then also kind of unresolved. And the Stam does seem to sort of resolve or bring evidence at least towards one interpretation of this Breita. But then the Stam really hits it home by saying, but there's another Breita. If you're walking along the way, or you're in the desert, you don't know when Shabbat occurs, you count 6 days and observe 1 day. And then the Stam says, yeah, this is Tiyuta Rabbi Chia bar Rav Tiyuta. This is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Chia bar Rav. And it repeats that. Yes, it's a conclusive reputation. And therefore, Rav Huna wins. And the Stam declares Rav Huna the winner. Okay, so just that language, tiyufta. So some people want to say the language of tiyufta, all of those like tiyufta to someone, tiyufta or hilchata, those kind of like cap or teku even, those capstone statements. Often some people trace those to like a really last layer of the Stam. Maybe that's even Gaonim, some people would say. But anyway, so this language tiyufta means refutation, and that's an example where the Stam is really playing the umpire of the Gemara. So what would this look like if you didn't have the Stam? You would have a debate between Amoraim, and then you would just have these 2 Breitas. And it would actually be really unclear how to read that first Breita. And then the second Breita would come in, and it would seem like, okay, the second Breita definitely supports Rav Huna. That I think is probably clear, but the Stam comes in and really just says it so explicitly that the second Breita disproves Rav Chia bar Rav, and the Stam also plays out what are all the different possibilities for that first Breita. And more than that, though, I think personally, and it's probably clear from just listening to me talk, that the most beautiful thing that the Stam does in this entire Gemara is actually it's philosophizing about the distinction between Rav Huna's opinion and Chia bar Rav's opinion. And that's in my opinion, that's really the Stam at its like most beautiful. But even that work of just taking these 3 sources and giving them shape and flow, and you can just kind of read it straight instead of having to say, okay, I have this Breita, like, does it agree with this? Does it not agree with this? How am I supposed to know? We could argue it 6 different ways. Like, the Stam really tries to fill that in for you. So that's the other piece where you start to really see how impressive the Stam is and how strong an editorial hand the Stam plays throughout the Bible. Okay. And you see that also when there are cases where the Stam kind of goes quiet. And even then, the Stam is not great at keeping its mouth shut. So we'll see that in 1 second. So sometimes the Talmud seems to be just a list of Tannaitic and Amoraic statements without the Stam trying to turn those statements into any kind of clear debate or discussion. Even then, we'll see the Stam gently show up here and there. But even in cases where all it is Amar, so right, said Rabbi so-and-so, next line said Rabbi so-and-so, next line said Rabbi so-and-so, and they don't seem to clearly disagree and there's no clear debate, even then, the Stam layer is still responsible for the organization of those statements. And often you can sort of find meaningful structure. Like, do they seem to be kind of ramping up, getting more and more extreme? All kinds of different questions you can ask, even when it's just statement after statement. And if there's meaning, then you can attribute that meaning to the Stam who organized those statements, potentially at least organized those statements in that way, or received the statements possibly already organized in that way, but kind of kept that organization when it was put when it was edited into the Babli. So here's an example. We're in Yoma 86b. A piece of vocabulary to introduce here would be the term memra. So a memra is just an Amoraic statement. And here we're going to see a bunch of them. So we have Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is actually Rabbi Yochanan is an Amora, and then we're going to see Rabbi Yonatan, and Rabbi Yonatan is a Tana, so that's why the different colors here. But they're really all kind of doing. It seems clearly very edited because it has this like pattern to it, and so how we imagine that editing process went down and who's responsible for it. Those are all kinds of these like big questions that we have about our oral tradition. But anyways, here goes. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan Gdola Tshuva Shedochet Lo Taseh Shabbat Torah. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Great is repentance as it overrides even a prohibition of the Torah." And then he's going to bring a quote from Jeremiah 3:1. And sometimes it's going to actually require kind of Rashi in order to understand how the quote proves what he is saying. And so he brings this quote about from Jeremiah that's about if a husband and wife divorce and then the wife marries someone else, she can't go back to that first husband. But the Jewish people have committed adultery with so many other gods. They've committed adultery against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, against our God, against our one and only God. And yet we return over and over again. So God accepts tshuva, Hashem accepts tshuva, even when a human spouse would not even be able to, would be prohibited from the Torah from accepting like tshuva from their wife in the way that God accepts our tshuva when we cheat on God. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yonatan now says, Gdola tshuva shemekaravet et hageulah. Great is repentance which hastens redemption. And then he brings an argument for that. So we have a verse, Uvaltzion goel v'shavei pashad Yaakov, a redeemer will come to Zion, and those who repent from transgression in Jacob. My time Uvaltzion goel. What is the reason that a redeemer will come to Zion? Mishum deshavei pashad Yaakov. It is because there are those who repent from transgression in Jacob. So repentance is what brings the redemption. Amar Rish Lakish Gdola Tshuva Shezodono Nasit Lo Kishkagot. Rish Lakish says, great is repentance as the penitent's intentional sins are counted for him as unwitting transgressions. And then he quotes from Hosea, Shuvah Yisrael Hashem. And the Gemara, but then here, this is a great example where we see the English calling it, the Gemara analyzes this. So that's the Stam, right? The Stam says, Ha'avon Mezidhu. Hold on. Doesn't sin here mean that you did it on purpose? And he calls it a stumbling block. Ini, is that true? And furthermore, doesn't Rish Lakish, in here the Stam is going to say, right, we had this statement by Rish Lakish that fits in, because it starts with Gdola Tshuva, which is what all of our Mimras are starting with here. And then, but the Stam is then going to say, hold on, don't we have a contradictory statement by Rish Lakish that says, Tshuva is awesome because one's intentional sins are counted as merits. So, first of all, says the Stam, I have a question about your reading of this pasuk. And second of all, says the Stam, I have a question on you, Reish Lakish, because here you said sins are made as if they're accidents. But don't you elsewhere say, Reish Lakish, that sins are made as if they're merits? And you bring a different proof text there. And so then the Stam goes on to resolve the seeming contradiction between the two statements by Reish Lakish. Lo kasha, it's not difficult. Kan me'ahava, kan me'yira. One, where you repent out of love, that's when your sins become merits. And the other, when you repent out of fear, that's where your sins becomes transgression. So it seems like we just have statement, statement, statement. All those statements line up so beautifully. Gdola, tshuva, sheh, something, right? Great is repentance, which blah, blah, blah. But here, even then, the Stam can't help itself, right? And here the Stam behaves almost in the way that the Amoraim behave towards the Mishnah. Last week, we saw that question, or minhu, right? Bang them against each other, compare them to each other. How, like, this Mishnah seems to be contradicting with this Baraita. Shouldn't they agree? And here we have the Stam saying, Reish Lakish, we found an internal contradiction within you. Also, we're going to compare them to each other. And then the way that Amoraim learn things out from comparing Mishnahs to Braitas or Mishnahs to each other, here we have the Stam comparing Reish Lakish to Reish Lakish. And again, learning something out about what happens to sin when you do teshuvah, depending on what motivated your teshuvah. All right, so let's put it all together and then we will take questions. So the Stam is the connector of the Talmud and it plays a number of different kinds of jobs. And I tried to create categories for those today. So the most important job of the Stam overall is that it just makes the Talmud easier to read. It means that you can go from one statement to another and the Stam will do the work for you of figuring out, do those statements conflict or not? Sometimes it'll even do the work for you of saying which statement wins, like it'll play the umpire role, for example. The Stam also philosophizes, the Stam asks questions, the Stam attempts resolutions. Overall, it just weaves the Talmud together. Why is it important for you to know this, right? Why do I need to recognize the Stam? Can't I just read the Gemara straight through and it just is what it is? Okay, so you can, and there's lots and lots and lots of different ways of learning. But the first thing I would say is that when you recognize the Stam, it helps you appreciate the historical development of the Talmud. So when you can recognize this statement comes from this time period, and these people who are talking now, these Amoraim, oh, they knew that statement, or they might have known that statement, whereas you cannot expect the Tana to know something that an Amora said, for example, because that Amora could have been 100, 200 years later than a Tana. So it helps you recognize who's talking to whom, who has what in their back pocket, and just generally kind of how the Talmud was developed. The next thing I'll say is that familiarizing yourself with the way the Stam works, that's what's going to make you a Gemara cop, right? A Gemara cop meaning you ask Gemara type questions. A lot of the most kind of classic Gemara type questions are actually the Stam's questions. So when we think of like the hallmarks of the Bavli, it's actually so much of that is the Stam. Like the Stam is really in a lot of ways the hallmark of the Bavli. And one way that we really know that is when you compare, and I didn't feel like we had time to do this today, but if you compare the same section of the Bavli with its counterpart in the Yerushalmi, that's when you really come to appreciate the Stam and the Bavli Stam. Some people like to say the Yerushalmi doesn't have Stam. That's a complicated thing to say. Like on the one hand, the Yerushalmi was closed before the time period in which the Bavli's Stam was written. So in that sense, the Yerushalmi does not have Stam because it's different people. But the Yerushalmi does have a kind of a plain voice or a narrative voice. So in that sense, it's quite similar to the Bavli, but it just is much, much less robust. So often you'll have to do the work yourself of figuring out, do these disagree? Oh, they seem like they disagree, but how can I reconcile it? Am I supposed to reconcile it? Who even wins at the end? All of that with the Yerushalmi, much more complicated to try and decipher. Um, Noticing when it is that the Stam is interjecting will help you make sense of the Gemara in general. So sometimes if you just feel like, wow, I'm so lost, the reason why you're lost is because we were having a debate amongst the Moraim, and then the Stam took that debate and just carried it somewhere totally different. That happens all the time. And in order to really follow what's happening, you have to recognize that shift. You have to recognize it used to be Rabbi Yossi was talking, and now it's Amar Lach Rabbi Yossi, and now I know that it's not Rabbi Yossi talking, it's the Stam talking through Rabbi Yossi, and maybe they have something different in mind, or maybe they have a different perspective, and really asking that question of, did Rabbi Yossi intend what the Stam are putting into his mouth? That can be a really interesting kind of beginning of a discussion or way of learning. And the last thing I would just say is like the Stam is beautiful. It is brilliant. I have so much adoration and respect for the Stam, and learning about it and learning to recognize it will help you just appreciate the wonders and glory of our tradition. So when we say, oh, the Stam is the last layer or it's the latest, that by no means means that it's the worst. It's maybe in fact the best. So when we can recognize the Stam and we can notice now it's the Stam talking, then we can understand the unique kind of artistry that the Stam is adding into our tradition. Okay, so with that, we've seen a bunch of different modes in which the Stam intervenes into our Gemara. And next week, we're going to be taking it even one step further and saying, it seems like, right, sometimes we see the Stam being the umpire. So how do we get from the umpire to actually lived halacha, what we're supposed to do in this world? And that's where we're going next week. So from the Gemara to halacha, from Stam to halacha, that's what we'll be looking at together next week. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to open it up for questions in the chat. So, okay, so one question that came in from Annette Hochstein is, when was the distinctiveness of the Stam recognized as a separate, unique voice? So already pretty early we have kind of descriptions, like that language of Stam is early language. It's not coming to me exactly when it is, but it could even be like internal to the Gemara. Sometimes I think you even have a description of some of the Gemara statements as Stam. And the question is just like, at what point was there sort of historical awareness that maybe that was a later layer? And I think that's kind of like a Wissenschaft sort of innovation. Like that's really coming more and more out of the academy, I think. But none of this stuff is particularly like heretical or undermining. The Gemara does recognize itself that it is putting people of different generations into conversation with each other. And you see that even just by the Stam. We saw an example of it today when the Stam is kind of like tipping its hat at like, yeah, Rabbi Yossi isn't really speaking right now. Like this is us speaking in Rabbi Yossi's voice, right? That's the Gemara understanding like we're a multi-generational conversation happening here. And that's kind of core to what the oral Torah is all about, right? The oral Torah is about taking principles and conversations and each generation reworking them and adding to them and growing them, and we're all doing that right now when we learn, right? So there's nothing like particularly, in my opinion at least, there's nothing heretical about recognizing the Stam as its own unique layer, but I do think a lot of the language about the Stam that I was using is heavily academically influenced. Is the Stam always chronologically the latest? Asks Madeline. And relatedly, Shindel says, so the Stam is a group of anonymous rabbis of different eras. I think what we would say to Shindel is anonymous rabbis, but not of such a wide variety of different eras. Like I think we would say the Stam of the Bavli comes at around 500 to 600 of the Common Era, but that there's layers with it, or at least Professor Halivni and people like him try to divide up layers within that pretty short period. And then to Madeline's question of, is the Stam always chronologically the latest? So some academics think that there are a few times we would have Gaonic interpolations into the Talmud, and that then would be the latest level of the Talmud. Usually, I think what they would identify as Gaonic interpolations are really small, and that would be when the Gemara says hilchata. So that's what we'll talk about a little bit next week when the Gemara really like declares something to be halachic. So some people see that as the latest layer of the Gemara, that hilchata. And we'll look at that again next week. So great question, Sharon says, where do Rav Ashi and Ravina come into the Stam? So Rav Ashi and Ravina, we sometimes say, Rav Ashi and Ravina compiled the Talmud, and we say that's about the year 500, and then the Stam comes after that. So how do Rav Ashi and Ravina fit into it? What we would normally say to that is that Rav Ashi and Ravina, all of the Amoraic statements and the way that they are organized coming after the Mishnah, that's Rav Ashi and Ravina. And then the Stam comes in and takes the kind of existing structure that Rav Ashi and Ravina established and just added in editorial voice beyond that. So you can imagine, I had 2 slides where it was sort of like, imagine this Gemara without the Stam. So that Gemara that I like created with the Stam edited out, some people would say, yeah, that's the Gemara of Rav Ashi and Ravina. And then the Stam comes along and is almost like a commentary on that Gemara so that you can understand it. Does anyone argue that the Stam was contemporaneous with the Amoraim, says Eliza Berger? Listen, I can't tell you that nobody thinks that. I can tell you that I would not be compelled by that because clearly the Stam knows the Amoraim and has all these like second order opinions about it. So if you're going to write a commentary on something, clearly that thing is going to exist before you're writing the commentary on it, right? Like you can't write a commentary on something that doesn't exist yet because that's just not a commentary. So I think it would be a very difficult way to understand that the Stam was contemporaneous with Amoraim. In the Gemara, great question, Leah Goldford. In the Gemara, is Stam written in Ktav Stam? Okay, wow, I'm so glad you asked that because that is going to allow me to clarify something important. Ktav Stam is actually Rashi Tivot. It is, oh gosh, what's the English for Rashi Tivot? Someone in the chat help me out. It's a acronym. That's the word, right? An acronym. Stam is Rashi Tivot for Sefer Torah Tefillin Mezuzah. Stam, when we say Ktav Stam, that's an acronym for Sefer Torah Tefillin Mezuzah. So you can try and imagine that out for yourself. Sefer Torah for the Samech, Tav for Tefillin, Mezuzah with a Mem, and that is Jewish scribal arts tradition. And sometimes we would say Ktav Stam refers to like exactly the way it looks with like all of the little crowns and tagin and whatever. Completely different word when we're talking about the Stam of the Gemara, or from when people in modern Hebrew say Stam, right? So the modern Hebrew Stam is much more connected to the Stam of the Gemara than the Sefer Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzah, handwritten on parchment cloth thing. So yeah, those have nothing to do with each other. I'm so glad you asked because obviously that's so confusing. So I'm really, really glad I had the opportunity to clarify. Okay, someone says, I think you should say it gives you a Gemara cop, not make you a Gemara cop. Okay, I accept. Okay, in one of the passages, Rav Oshai and Abaye, great question. Rav Oshai and Abaye seem to be reacting to the Stam, which would have been later. So how can they react? So that's the Stam's editing that makes it seem like they're reacting. And actually, if you take the Stam out of it, they still make sense without the Stam. It's just confusing, like what exactly are they talking about? So the Stam is the one who weaves it all together to make it seem like they're reacting to that same conversation that the Stam is having, but that's actually the Stam's artistry at work that makes it seem that way. Have any academics, hi Nancy, have any academics tried to identify the Stam with particular rabbis' names? I'm not familiar with that. I'm not sure how we would do that exactly. Like we would need to maybe have like outside documents from this time period, which I don't think we have. Like we have non-Talmudic Gaonic documents, but that's starting in like 600. And then we know who like the earliest of the Gaonim were. So maybe there are some academics who think those named earliest Gaonim are themselves maybe the Stam. I could imagine that there are people who talk about that. I'm just not familiar with it, but I would definitely believe that there's an attempt in that direction. Okay. I'm not totally sure what you mean to say when Rav Yosef is the editor. I'm not sure what that refers to. Okay, one thing I do want to mention is for people who did this class last year, you might remember that there were quizzes. So we're going to be posting quizzes for the last class and for this one later this week. So stay tuned for that. And with that, so we'll see you back next week. Thank you all so much for following along, for the great questions. Really appreciate all of you. It's such a privilege to learn together.
Thank you, everyone. Good night, or have a great day, depending where you are.